Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Well, it's been 3 months since immigration officials descended on the tiny town of Postville in northeastern Iowa to conduct what would become the largest immigration raid in U.S. history. On May 12th, helicopters, buses, and vans carrying dozens of armed immigration agents descended on agri-processors, the largest kosher slaughterhouse and meatpacking plant in the country. Nearly 400 workers, most of them Mexican and Guatemalan, were arrested. Nearly 300 of them were charged with aggravated identity theft and Social Security fraud. Many were sent to prisons scattered across the state. Postville lost more than a quarter of its population in the raid. And for those left behind, namely the wives and children of the men taken away, the town has been turned to what some have described an open-air prison. Dozens of immigrant women remain in Postville without status or a means of support. Many of them are even forbidden from leaving and have been made to wear electronic monitoring bracelets. The women are now forced to rely on donations from St. Bridget's Roman Catholic Church and the local food pantry. The Reverend Paul Outerkirk spent the past half-century as a priest and has been in retirement for 5 years when he was called back to active duty at St. Bridget's after the raid. He joins us now on the phone from Postville. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy. Good to be with you this morning.
It's very good to have you with us. Describe what's happening in Postville.
At the present moment, the women you described as being prisoners are still here. I know of only, out of 43 that had leg monitoring devices, I know of only 6 so far that have received permission to go home and had the monitors removed. A couple went yesterday. So we are constantly providing for all the rest, since they can't work, have no income, and have children. Right now, one of the primary concerns is getting the children into school. And school here in Postville begins on Thursday, and we still talk to many of the mothers who are afraid to put their children in school. And I talked to a young girl, she's about 5th grade, yesterday, who said she couldn't go because she didn't have money to buy school supplies. So we're trying to sort through all of that and help them as much as we can.
Can you go back to the beginning and describe exactly what happened in May?
On May 12th, the raid took place, and right after the raid, when the buses began to take people away, about between 300 and 400 people rushed to our church out of fear, and for the next 6 days, they lived, slept, ate, and many of them refused to leave the church. We had them sleeping in our church, sleeping in the hall. They were afraid to go home because the common fear was that immigration would know where their apartments were, their homes were, and would come and take them and their children away. And so we kept them. And they relied on us for everything. At one time, according to my own calculations, we were feeding up to 1,000 people a day because we had to bring in food, volunteer workers, and our parish kitchen is not that big. But thanks to outside donations from various service organizations and area churches, we were able to feed them. And at the end of that week, we encouraged them to go back to their apartments because we had to provide them some kind of a normality. The church and the hall was being taxed to the extreme, and little by little they began to go home. And then we began to look into their needs. You know, what were their needs? They needed food, they needed clothing, they needed advice. They wanted to know where their husbands were. And the third thing we had to be aware of is that they were going to need some legal help. And here in Postville, there are no immigration lawyers here.
I wanted to turn now to our next guest. We're joined by Father Paul Outerkirk. He's speaking to us from Postville. But we turn now to our next guest from the American Civil Liberties Union, which recently obtained a government manual distributed to defense lawyers who were assigned to represent the immigrant workers arrested in the Postville raid. According to the ACLU, the document contains pre-packaged scripts for plea and sentencing hearings, as well as documents providing for guilty pleas and waivers of rights that were used to push more than 300 Postville workers through mass criminal proceedings as quickly as possible. Monica Ramirez, a staff attorney with the ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project, joining us on the phone from San Francisco. Monica Ramirez, welcome to Democracy Now! Explain this document.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. The government manual provided for the workers to waive, as you said, all of their legal rights, and in the overwhelming majority of cases to plead guilty to charges of falsely using identity documents for employment. The manual itself was an important tool used to rush defendants through the criminal justice and immigration systems in an unprecedented way. The Postville raid processed hundreds of immigrant workers, as you mentioned, with unprecedented speed. While the size of the raid is significant, the critical and novel element that sets Postville apart from prior immigration raids that we've seen in the past 2 years or so was the pre-planned and massive criminal prosecution of immigrant workers. And, there are a number of key factors that by design or fact were used in combination in Postville to compromise, if not outright negate, meaningful legal representation, voluntary and knowledgeable waivers of rights, and public confidence in a fair prosecutorial and judicial process. These factors include appointment of few defense counsel to represent multiple defendants, the use of exploding 7-day plea offers, and the conditioning of pleas upon defendants accepting stipulated judicial orders of deportation that compel the waiver of all rights and protections under the immigration laws. So this was definitely an unprecedented raid, and the combination of factors here seriously undermined meaningful legal representation and raises a lot of disturbing questions about whether the constitutional rights of the workers were protected in these prosecutions.
I recently spoke to Eric Camay, the Spanish court interpreter who spoke out for the workers rounded up in Postville. I asked him to describe his experience at the trial.
It was a unique experience for me in my 23 years as a federal interpreter. It started with waiting around in the courtroom until they started bringing in the defendants, and they were shackled at the waist, wrists, and feet, and coming in rows of 10. Then they sat down to be arraigned. And one of the first things that struck me is that there didn't seem to be a presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence became kind of like empty words because they were shackled, they were on an immigration detainer, so they didn't have any right to bail like normally defendants would. So that's how it started. It was a very long process that lasted 2 weeks, and as I went along day after day, there was a new irregularity in the process, and eventually, I guess there was an irregularity at every step, I would say. Comparing this process, this fast-tracking judicial proceedings with the judicial proceedings that I've watched in federal court over 23 years of professional practice.
He's a professor of modern language